1. Was me supposed to tell Simple Ranger? Was me supposed to tell Simple Ranger how Chuck Nunn Jr. done wronged the man that wronged him and fleen to parts unguessed? Brought up the Ranger to date on Chuck and Mona May Nunn's boy, Chuck Jr., closest thing to handsome and semi-divine we got here in Minogue, Oklahoma. Good luck, bad luck man, who everything that hit him stuck and got valuable. But on whom of this late time the vicissitudes of human relatings had wrought grief and retinal aggravation to such an extreme that C. Nunn Jr. lost his temper to a nameless despair and got him some vengeance. Told Nunn's tale the Simple Ranger, the damaged dust scout, who is an old man, watched his farm blow away in the hard and depressed high-winded days of the bowl, got farmless, but however angled some job out of F. Delano R's WPA and set himself up in a plywood shack on the big dirt between here and El Reno, drawing government pay as a watcher for major or calamitous dust. Stayed out there near on 40 years till looking at the dust made him damaged. Now he's too old not to be back, roving the streets in a kind of crazy DJ vu. Minogue, Oklahoma's own toothless R. Winkle wants to reknow the lives of his people and their children after 40 alone years of trying to make out the shape of his farm in the air. Buys me my personal beers with the checks some Washington, D.C. computer sends him too much of, and I tell Simple Ranger things about Minogue only he don't know. Told him some facts about Chuck Nunn Jr., with whom even the high winds declined to mess. How the prodigiousness of his 1948 birth tore up his mama Mona May's innards so bad that even today the woman can only fall asleep after hot pads and loud opera, and requires institutional caring. How Chuck Jr. was swarthy and pubic by 10, bearded and bow-legged and randy by 12. How his late daddy tried to whip him just once, like to broke his belt to smithers on Chuck Jr.'s concrete behind. How C. Jr. flipped his cherry on our 7th grade music teacher, a pale, jagged woman, but highly scented, who even today passes through Minogue, Oklahoma in a Trailways bus every leap year, needle-pointing and humming vacant tunes of love's non-requiting. How Chuck Nunn Jr.'s color was that of the land, and how his sweat smelled like copper, and how the good ladies of Minogue got infallibly behooved to sit down whenever he passed, walking as walks a man who is in communion with forces, legs bandy and boots singing with the Amarillo spurs he won himself at the '65 State Fair in O City for kicking the public ass of a bull without but one horn, but a sharp one. Told Simple Ranger, whose rate of beer is scary on account of no teeth to hinder a maximal swallow, told Ranger how, while he was out on the big dirt watching skies and eating peas out of cans, Minogue, Oklahoma HS won the state HS football title 2 years back-to-back with Chuck Nunn Jr. at quarterback and defense and myself at equipment manager. How in '66, in the state final versusing Minogue, Oklahoma and Enid, Oklahoma, our sworn and fatal foes for all time, how in the final game's final few competitive seconds, Enid, down by 5, granted the ball to their giant ringer nameless Negro wingback, who took off from the Enid 11 with the ball in his hands and wrongness in his eyes, meaning harm to Minogue, Oklahoma's very heart and self-perception. This Negro blowing through Minogue boys like grit on big wind, plus getting interferences run by 2 cowpunchers boys of human form but geologic size, plus a Canadian martial arts expert in padded bathrobe and metal cleats, who played dirty and low. How, I'm seeing this now, mind, how after a climactic and eternal chase down the field and catch from behind, a swift, cruel, red-bearded and glitter-eyed C. Nunn Jr. brought down the whole stadium house, solved the runner-plus interference problem at our 10's Enid sideline by tackling the huge Cowboys, the low Canadian kicker, the inhumanly fast Negro, 3 Enid cheerleaders, a referee, and 1 10-gallon cooler of Enid Gatorade, all at one cataclysmic time. Busted a igneous leg on an interferer spine and healed up in just weeks, bandier than before. Got a hall of Minogue, Oklahoma HS named Chuck Nunn Jr. Hall. 2. Chuck Nunn Jr. more God than not. Told Simple Ranger some data on how Chuck Nunn Jr. more God than not to those of us peers that live for a whiff of his jet trail, ate up his school in town, left us bent and in mid-urn his 18th year, and moved on to Oklahoma University, Norman, at whence he was observable throwing high-altitude televised spirals and informing his agriculture and range management teachers of facts they did not know. Then how Nunn chucked it all to give time as a volunteer in the United States' involvement in Vietnam, whence trickled down rumors of the glory and well-armed mightiness of Nunn, how he toted his unit's 50 calibers up sheer and cliff-like impediments to conflict, how he declined to duck, never once crawled or ate mud, however never even once smelled lead in his cranial vicinity, how he got alone and surrounded by VCRs, Viet Cong regulars, in 71, and through sheer force of personality and persuasion, persuaded the whole battalion of sly slanted Charlies to turn their own guns on themselves, how etc., etc., how he sent me a postcard with a red bloom of napalm jungle on the front, wrote how he wished my personal vision was better so I could leave the feed store and get over there to watch and whiff the trail of his jet. Simple Ranger's eyes is the color of the sky. There's speculation hereabouts concerning if you look at something long enough, does your eyes take its color. I profess to telling the gray-eyed ranger, plus a none-happy group of Minogue civilians, how Chuck Nunn Jr. returned home from OU Norman and Southeast conflict more theory than man, how there was a welcome parade, fussy and proud, with a tuba, how the immoderate and killer twister that hit in 74, this twister old Simple Ranger, by then more than a tinge damaged, chased for 12 helter and skelter miles in his DeSoto, said he smelled his aloft land in every revolution, finally wound up upside down in phone lines and no sign of his car evermore. Didn't never come down. That hit in spring, 74, the day after Nunn's returning in parade, how that sucker ripped the roof off Nunn's late daddy's machine shed, sucked 2 in Rockwell prints and Nunn's late daddy out a busted ranch house window to follow Simple Ranger's DeSoto in a straight up, and how it took the Nunn's TV aerial antenna off the house roof and flew the electric javelin out a fair quarter mile, flung the pole down into Nunn land like a mumble peg, and how up from this TV speared ground, just inherited ex officio by Chuck Nunn Jr., come a bubbling crude, black gold, Texas tea, how Nunn paid off his late missing daddy's sheep ranch's mortgage with revenues, put his scrambled and operatic Mama Mona May into institutional caring, and took over the Nunn sheep business with such a slanderous cunning and energy, plus oil money, that soon amounts of C&J brand sheep was bulging, straining, and bleeding against the barbed wire limit of Nunn's spread, mating in frenzies, plus putting out wool hand over hoof, plus fighting over which one got to commit suicide whenever Nunn looked like he might, I told Simple Ranger, be hungry. Was telling the Dust Watcher how C. Nunn Jr. passed up multitudes of come-hitherest cheerleaders and oriental princesses to return to Minogue and enter into serious commitment with his childhood sweetheart, the illegally buxom and tall Glory Joy Dubois, closest thing to femininity and pulchritude that to date exists in Minogue, Oklahoma. Eyes like geometry, and an all-around bodily form of high allure and near religious implication. And just as I was commencing an analogy relating the shape of Glory Joy's hips to the tight curve of the distant big dirt horizon, the door to the outside Minogue tavern busted inward, and there against the dusty sunlight was framed the tall, angstified, and tortured frame of Glory Joy Dubois. Handed to her limpid and Euclidean eyes, hips that was similar to horizons, brushing the trauma-struck frame of the busted inward door. She stood like that for a time, looking at me, then come over at the table we was all at, whereupon she stood, staggered, dropped and flopped in a floor direction, her racked and convulsively semi-conscious frame moving in directions like the Minogue, Oklahoma HS halftime band, spelling out kicked in the butt by love, or forlorn and subject to devastation following the loss of Chuck Nunn Jr. due to the hurtful precariousness of his post-accident temper. 3. Nunn's personal undoing was the day it rained sheep. Nunn's personal undoing was the day it rained sheep, I outlined to Simple Ranger, as me and several civilians carried the forlornly swooned and flopping frame of Glory Joy Dubois to our table, smeared cold rolling rock on her pulse points, and propped her up in a splinterless chair to come around to the outlining of our mutual Minogue sadnesses and troubles. Told Simple Ranger how the success of the Nunn sheep ranch, plus the devotion of the near-beautiful Glory Joy, had aroused the ire and jealousy of TRex Minogue, the antique and hermetically reclusive, also malignant and malevolent, Minogue, Oklahoma sheep mogul, plus the manufacturer of the illegal and chemically unstable sweet potato whiskey that kept our neighboring reservation's Native Americans glazed and politically inactive, and how following the spectacular rise of the Nunn sheep operation under the energy and agriculture degree of Chuck Jr., who was, remember, a shtuppin' the little lady T-Rex himself had wanted to a shtup since she was 12. How in light of all this, it's comprehensible how T-Rex Minogue repeatedly, and with above-average vigor, attempted to financially acquire, legally finagle, then violently appropriate the Nunn sheep operation from Chuck Nunn Jr. How Nunn was too petroleumly rich, well and savagely educated, and martially formidable, respective, for any of the attempts to fructify. How Nunn took all Minogue's shit with good humor, even the complimentary and ribboned jelly jars of yam liquor that T-Rex kept sending Glory Joy. Each attached to a note headed Notice of Formal Wooing, all with great and superior humor, until finally T-Rex, a man wholly allergic to any distance between himself and his way, least here in this town his own daddy built before getting fatally harmed by some politically active Native Americans, until T-Rex arranged for his younger antique brother V.V. Minogue, a benign however treatably alcoholic range hand and poet, his stuff rhymed I'm told, who was under the thumb of dependency on T-Rex's secret sweet potato recipe, I informed the ranger. For V.V. and two humongous out-of-town cowpunchers boys from Enid, yes, the old interferers from the climax of the state football title game in '66, for them to explosively dynamite a large and bulk-like portion of Chuck Nunn Jr.'s ranch's flock-infested grazing land, how whereupon the land was in fact dynamited by V.V. and the geologic Enid boys, and how it rained various percentages of sheep in Minogue, Oklahoma for one whole nauseous afternoon 2 years ago next Ascension. As Simple Ranger sat up straight at this and informed myself and the civilians that he himself had heard a far-off thunder booming off the dome of Big Dirt space, plus seen a singular pink-white rain from clear out in his shack on dirt 2 ascensions back, and had attributed the experiences to theology, plus the effects of damage, Glory Joy Dubois fluttered her way into consciousness and arousal, smoothed her brass-colored and towering hair with a hand motion of such special sensuousness that 2 civilians tipped back over in their chairs and was largely lost for the rest of the duration, and entered into the therapy of it all, getting on the outside of several beers and detailing for the ranger how it had been, that dark, fluffy, and rusted day, running with C. Nunn Jr. through the blasted heaths of exploded former pasture, ruining her best silk umbrella for all time, watching her man move through turf, mutton, and gore like the high wind of madness itself, floundering bow-legged through gruesome fields of gruesomer detonated wool, catching plummeted major percentages of particular favorite sheep in a shearing basket, Glory Joy watching his mood and attitude getting more and more definable in terms of words such as grief, sorrow, loss, disorientation, suspicion, anger, and finally, unambiguous and unequivocal rage. How as coyotes and buzzards began to sweep in off Big Dirt and commence a scavengerial orgy unsurpassed in modern Oklahoma in terms of pure and bilious nasty. How C. Nunn Jr. unhitched his '68 souped entirely up Italian sports car from his OU Norman quarterback career and fairly flew off the ranch east on ricketed 2-lane 40 toward the gigantic and private T-Rex Minogue spread, without so much as a kiss my foot to Glory Joy, who watched her man inject his vehicle of light into the chewed-up straight-shot road to TRM, his mind on the noun T-Rex Minogue, the near Garun's confrontation, reparation, possibly even reciprocation, i.e. detonation. 4. So it went back and forth. So it went back and forth, myself and Glory Joy, Simple Ranger gumming his bottle, his expression moving between vacant and preoccupied, the odd and frequent passing civilian patrons getting pulled to the table, beer in hand, whenever Glory Joy rose her 6-foot self up to tell what it had been similar to, those lonesome days of trying to run off carrionizers and mop up sheep percentages and run a ranch, admittedly now a smaller spread by a good measure, all herself. She'd rise up in her purple satin middy and pay public tribute to the resemblance the days after Nunn's undoing and accident bore to hell right up on the gray and psoriatic skin of this world's land. So it went back and forth, me handling the historical and observational, Glory Joy the personal and emotive. Was me revealed to Simple Ranger how, after the rain of sheep, Nunn was fairly flying in his little Italian sports car east on 40 to present to T-Rex Minogue the gift of T-Rex's own personal ass, and how meanwhile, back at Nunn's ranch, a good part of Minogue, Oklahoma commenced to arrive and gawk and Kodak and catch mutton cuts in receptacles. Honey, this one old Miss Pete in yellow rain boots and slicker and a pince nez told me as she adjusted her hairnut, she told me, "Honey, when it rains bread and fishes, you get yourself a bucket is what you do." And how but meanwhile, T-Rex Minogue's benign but subdigital brother VV, steeped in post-explosion guilt and self-loathing, plus not a little ode to sweet potato, was speeding away from T-Rex's enormous spread for the deep dirt of Oklahoma's interior to commune with himself, guilt, pain, and a whole big truck full of jelly jars and distilled yam, and was accordingly fairly flying west on Rickety 40 in this huge old truck. And at an ominous and coincidental point in time, VV subconsciously decided, in some dark and pickled back part of his oceanic head, to see just what it was like driving his gargantular 3-ton IH home-modified yam liquor transport truck on the left side of the hills, valleys, and sine-wing curves of 2-lane 40. VV's left side being Chuck Nunn Jr.'s by right course. And how here come Chuck Nunn Jr. ripping up the highwayed hill right dab equidistant center between the two ranches. And here's VV driving in a pickled manner in an inappropriate lane up the hill's other side. And how there was impact at high speed, of a head-on kind, between the two. Impact, I said to Simple Ranger, plus damage in no small measure. And Glory Joy Dubois testified to the feelings she felt upon arriving in my pickup upon the accident scene, some pathetically few miles down 40, and seeing her Chuck Nunn Jr. literally wearing his little impacted car. How there was white steam whistling out of his tires, out of the accordion that had been his engine, and out of Nunn's head, which looked on first look to be minus a jaw, consciousness, and 2 healthy eyes, in that order. How red lights and sirens come emergencying out across dirt. How the emergency folks had to cut Chuck Jr. out of his car with torches. How they was scared to move him on account of spinal considerations. How Minogue Sheriff Onan L. Axford announced to some press and media that wearing a safety belt, which Nunn was, had been all that come between Chuck Nunn Jr. and eternal flight out of punctured windshield. She told how Nunn come more or less too, in his little wrapped-around car, his torch-lit busted eyes and blood like bearings in deep oil. "Remember the eyes of Nunn?" I interjaculated, and Simple Ranger give me a watching look. And as Glory Joy finished up communicating the anger and justicelessness she felt upon seeing T-Rex's brother VV Minogue listing far to port up against the largely unharmed cab of his IH liquor truck, weepy, shit-faced, scratchless. How VV's accidental ass had been immunized and preserved by how some old International Harvester trucks turned out had one of them airbags in them that nobody knew about, from an IH experiment in the 1960s that didn't make the economic wash. But so the whole accident that was VV's pickled fault, and that impacted Nunn's hairy jaw and busted both his eyes, plus a pelvis, plus concussed the sucker into moral comatosity and undoing. The whole damaging calamity had consisted for VV Minogue of just a jillionth of a second sensuous experience of soft and giant marshmallow. The white foaming lumpy bag was still filling up the big truck's cab at this time, I remember, starting to jut and ooze out the busted windows, looking dire and surreal, of a marshmallow instant, plus a upcoming year of subsequent legalities. As Glory Joy climaxed telling how it felt, and took a deserved grief intermission, a certain palate-clefted but upstanding civilian turned to me and he say, "Sucker busted his eyes?" being real interested in physical damage, birth defects, accidental maimings, and the like. "Sucker busted his eyes?" the Simple Ranger repeated in a rich, gritty voice that croaked of advanced gray lung, the disease most specially feared by us who spend our lives on big dirt. Out of a consideration for Glory Joy Dubois, who was wearing her pain like a jacket now, I lowered my voice as I invited civilian and ranger to picture what 2 cantaloupe melons dropped from a high height would resemble. If they wanted the picture of how Nunn's eyes got busted out his head via general impact and collision, hanging right out his head, on to jolly insecure. And was me told the table how except for the eyes, the jaw, and the pelvis, which to our community relief all healed up, prime face, in just weeks, leaving good luck bad luck Chuck Jr. a sharper shot, wickeder dancer, and nearer to handsome than before. How except for that, the major impact and damage from the accident had turned out to be Nunn's head, mind, and sensibility. How right there in the post-accidental car he suddenly got conscious, but evil. Evil, I emphasized, and there were shudders from civilians and Glory Joy. And how a evil Chuck Nunn Jr. fought and cussed and struggled against his spinal restraints, invected against everything from the Prime Mobile to OU Norman's head football coach, Mr. Barry B. Switzer hisself. How even slicker than blood and eyes hanging ominous half out their holes, Nunn had laid out 2 paramedics and a deputy and shined up my personal chin when we tried to ease him into an ambulance. How right there on rickety 2-lane 40, Nunn publicly withdrew his love from his mama Mona May, me, the whole community of Minogue, Oklahoma, and especially from Glory Joy, who he loudly accused of low general spirits and what he called a lack of horizontal imagination. Chuck Jr. was just in a moral coma from the accident is all it was, declared a Glory Joy, known from here to next door for the deepness of her loyalty toward Nunn. She told Simple Ranger how C. Nunn Jr. suffered 6 evil and morally comatose post-damage days, his sense of right and wrong and love and hate smothered to chaotic, but how the subsequent Nunn thankfully remembered none of those 6 dark and devilish days of screaming and vandalizing in the Minogue County Hospital, where he was at, as restrained as was possible given the personality and persuasiveness of Nunn vis-a-vis orderlies. How Nunn woke up familiar and normal on the 7th day and asked about location, which is always a real good medical sign. How we was all relieved. 5. Nunn's surface healed up, but with something interior askew. Got dark outside. Gritty afternoon dark that means serious wind through high dirt, movement of soil and sky, a swirl that fakes Twister once a week and keeps the tourist minimal. And there was a peculiar but occasional black flutter at some of the tavern windows, and Simple Ranger got aroused, disquiet. Me and GJ was telling the Ranger how Chuck Nunn Jr.'s surface healed up as fast and fine as the town could expect, how he was back on his post-explosion ranch and inside Glory Joy's affections and limbs by 6 weeks' time, and how his broke cantaloupe eyes got put back together via skill and laser by doctors, paid for through VV Minogue's subsequent legalities. VV was in institutional caring and detox up in El Reno by this time. How the eyes healed together so right and improved that none could claim to spot dust movement against the sky's very curve. No small claim. But how something inside Nunn got left by the impact askew, his interior self messed with, hurtin', under strain, all due to the lingering insecurity of the previously busted Nunn temper and moral sense. We got frightened of his temper and moral sense, Glory Joy told from a window she was at, standing, curious and distracted, looking out against dark at something against the seam of land and air that stretched tight across the dirt. Chuck Jr. got scared of his self. Ever get scared of your own self? Painful. Glory Joy had mummed up to Nunn from concern and such, but Chuck Jr. got subsequently informed by friends and civilians about his 6-day moral coma, about things he'd done, said, and implied in the privacy of a special padded hospital wing, things he did not recollect. Got told of an unnameable evil and rage directed at the universe in general, one that was diuretic and fearsome to see in a previous semi-demiurge, larger than life. It got known around Minogue, Oklahoma, that while his quality Italian seatbelt had saved his exterior, the impact with VV following the rain of sheep had knocked something loose in the center of Nunn. Chuck Jr. got informed on this fact, and it chewed at him. His temper got scary, Glory Joy said. It got precious and valuable to us, like only something you was scared to death to lose can get. She'd got to caressing the peeling frame of the window she was at with a mournful and musing that repercussed among the civilians piling up in circles at our little table. His temper got insecure. We lived in around-the-clock fear of when Chuck Jr. might possibly lose his temper. Focus in on that verb lose, SR, I told Simple Ranger. The lady means it special. Whenever C. Nunn Jr. lost his post-accident temper, he lost the sucker real and true. It became gone, absent, elsewhere, blew away to unfindable locations. A state of nameless and potential eternal rage and evil every time he but stubbed his toe or some such shit. I put an earnest hand on the Ranger's deep gray sleeve, tried to get his eyes off the air outside the window. Chuck Nunn Jr. lived in fear of, plus alienation from, his own personal temper. Was Glory Joy Dubois told us in emotive terms how collision and concussion and coma had left Nunn's interior bent, how the bow-legged pride of Minogue, Oklahoma had to scrutinize and rein his own emotional self each minute, for fear the upset or anger could loop him back into a blank white comality of evil and meanness, how his tender gentleness toward G.J. Dubois got so extreme as to crowd pitiful. So scared was he that if he stopped loving her for a second, he'd never get it back. How the rare times when a vicissitude of human relating, sheep shearing, or pastor status pissed him off, he'd get positively underworldly with anger. A bearded unit of pure and potent rage, ranging his sheep's ranges like something mythopoeic, thunderous, less man or thing than sudden and dire force, will, ill. How the bright blank evil'd stay on him for a day, 2, a week, and Glory Joy shut herself in the storm cellar Chuck Nunn Jr. himself had lined with impregnable defensive steel, and she'd stay put, drinking bottled water and watching out for Nunn activity through an emergency periscope Chuck Jr. had punctured through the storm cellar's roof for just such episodic periods. And how, after time, Nunn would come back out of the blind, nameless hate, the objectless thirst for revenge against whole planets. How he'd find his spent and askew temper on some outer range of detonated Nunn land and return, pale and ignorant, to a towering, quivering, forgiven Glory Joy. Chuck Jr. steered way clear of even thinking about TRex Minogue's place for fear he'd kill the old man, I told the ranger. Got terrified of even the concept of what T-Rex might could do to his emotions and sensibilities. The tenderness and care in Chuck Nunn Jr. showed me were inhuman, Glory Joy semi-sobbed, her eyes resembling a Saint Vetus of red threads. Superhuman, not of this landed earth. Simple Ranger got moved here at something. 6. Was buzzards that had stayed on. Now, the peculiar darkness and peculiarer fluttering outside the outside Minogue bar was in fact buzzards. 2 civilians at the busted inward bar door told us. Glory Joy and the ranger nodded absent to theirselves. We took looks outside. There was buzzard presence and activity of thought-provoked scope. The air was dark and agitated with wings, beaks, soft bellies. The suckers soared round. The air outside the outside Minogue bar was swirling and influenced by regiments of the buzzards that had got drawn to Big Dirt by the rain of Nunn Mutton 2 ascensions past, and had stayed on. It was like something giant was coming out of the dirt to die, the ranger said in a gravelly whisper, staring his eyes past civilians' door into a swirling soiled gray, looking for signals, his land, his car. This sucker's damaged, whispered a civilian, low. But I commenced to revelate to Simple Ranger about Chuck Nunn Jr.'s special and secret post-accident strain. You knew about the secret post-accident strain when I didn't till it was too late and Chuck Jr. was temperless and gone? Asked a disbelieving Glory Joy, pale, tight of lip, hip shot. She come back over, totin' menace. I sympathied Glory Joy, told her how Chuck Jr. had suffered a spell of his optical dislocation over to the feed store once after I once slapped him on his back over a humorous joke. And how he'd dislocated, and I'd seen, and how he'd sworn into an eternity of silence about his secret. A sworn promise I kept till he wronged T-Rex Minogue and Vamiste. I told Simple Ranger and the civilians about the hidden and subterranean strain, suffered by a already askew C. Nunn Jr., caused by his post-impact with VV Minogue's spontaneously detachable eyes. Told some historic facts, how the doctor sewed up Nunn's busted ball-bearing melon eyes with laser and technocracy, and left him farther down the line from blindness and blearer than ever, but with a hitch. Those eyes, sewed with light, was left smaller. Ain't hard to see that the doctors at the hospital had to take them some slack up from Nunn's ball-busted eyes to laser-stitch the bust with, and how the de-slacking of the eyes left them tight, small, rattling in the sockets, insecure. They'd fall out of his head, I told the company of men that was round our table about 3 deep, countless bottles of Rolling Rock already dealt with, stacked in a pyramid and headed for ceiling. Be like the accidental impact all over again at times. Slap Chuck Jr. on the back, or maybe he'd bend down after an untied lace, or, worse, if he'd sneeze at all. Ever see the man sneeze, personally? A post-accident sneeze, Glory Joy? Glory Joy's powdered and geometry-eyed face got singular, loose. Looked like Walter Matthau a second. Out of my stimulating of a old but sudden recognition, unclear but true. She got smaller in her chair, too interested by half in the label on her 9th Rolling Rock. Was me, told Simple Ranger, who kept coughing and sniffing, nervous at the special smell of interested buzzard, how Chuck Nunn Jr. commenced to buckle under the emotive strain of 2 little post-accidental eyes that exited their sockets and dangled by cords down his bearded and near-handsome face at the slightest gravitational invitation. How the twin pressures of fear that the possible sight of his insecure and AWOL eyes could repulse the love clear out of Glory Joy Dubois, plus how the fragileness of his coma-inclined and skittish temper might at any time dust from Nunn's concussed head any sense of aught, right, love, or concern for men, man, woman, or Glory Joy. How all this shit wore on Chuck Nunn Jr. How he got wore, thinned out, legs bandier, skin loose and paler than land, copper sweat vertigrized, rattling eyes milky and other directed. Inferior and progressing damage, I summed. 7. And, penclimactically. Glory Joy revealed how, some weeks back, the infamous pollinated dust of pre-ascension springtime Minogue, Oklahoma brought on a hay fever that had Chuck Jr. woolly and writhen with secret strain, plus mysteriously excusing himself from her every few minutes to go out to the privy to sneeze. And to reinsert his recalcitrant and thranotic eyes, she moaned. I understand the total picture now. God bless his soul and mine together. Tears by this point in time. And how, the torpid gray 3 days past morning of Nunn's temper's final debarkation into vengeance and fleeing, Glory Joy revealed, a fit of uncontrollable and pollinated sneezing had reared up out of the dusty land its own self and overtook a tired, tattered Chuck Nunn Jr. there at breakfast, at the table, and how to Glory's combined horror and pathos he'd sneeze his keen but tiny eyes right out into his bowl of shredded wheat, and milk and fiber covered his sight, and how Glory Joy had rushed over to his sides, but he was already up, horrified and swinging the balls, the twin cords the color of innards, Nunn fumbling in a wild manner to refit his lariatic eyes, healthy ears keen to the sound of the horror, pathos of the gasps of Glory Joy, temper bidding adios altogether to the flat gray world of the limited but steady-keeled mortal mind. And off he flew for the second recent historic time, I climaxed. This time in the impact-proof and souped-up used cement mixer he'd bought with VV's legalities. Off he flew east on rickety two-lane 40, blank with hate and optical mortification, to reciprocally wrong old T-Rex and VV Minogue, who'd malignantly through willful and explosive machinations and vehicularism caused Nunn the twin insecurities of eye and moral temper. Simple Ranger finished up for me, in a curious plus haunting voice that was not. More I reflected there, the more I got convinced that those polysyllables were not of his gravelly gray lung voice, somehow. His own, somehow. Was telling Simple Ranger how C. Nunn Jr., blood in his eye, plus cereal, roared out on that military mixer, in mood and stature similar to a demiurge, a banshee, a angry mythopoeum, roared out east on 4-0 to deprive T-Rex Minogue and wretched VV of their animate status. How he left the tall, forlorn, and quivering Glory Joy Dubois to watch the ever tinier fog of his thunderous exhaust, his dusty final jet trail, 3 days past, and how Nunn never got seen no more. How the rumorous talk around town was that he'd forcibly detached the Minogue brothers' malignant, benign, reclusive, alcoholic asses, reattached them in inappropriate and harm-conductive locations, left the two of them twisted, bent, wronged, full of gnash and rue, and close to expiration, and fleeing the state and nation in his unimpactable mixer, taking on down the last road to fullness, redemption, and temper. Any old civilian at all can conceptualize Glory Joy Dubois' crumpled Walther Matthau-ness by this revelational and recapitulatory time, but it's something just other to visualize how she refilled, smooth and animated, in a negative manner, toward the sight that now half filled the busted frame of the door of the outside Minogue bar, appeared against the swirling swooping light through soil outside. The sight, dressed and draped in a dusty black, was the ancient and all-around ravaged frame of T-Rex Minogue, appearing publicly for the first time since the wool price crisis of '67. He was seated in a dirt-frosted wicker and electricity-powered wheelchair, which hissed a low electric hiss as T-Rex made, first entry, then his way over to near the plywood bar and the combined and uncharitably disposed side of our whole crowded 3-deep pyramided table. Was me whispered to Simple Ranger, Minogue, T-Rex, first public display since '67, crisis, wool. And the Ranger nodded, his eyes more full of knowing than sky a second. Glory Joy Dubois here was getting hostiler looking as she stared at old T-Rex by the bar in his chair, covered by a black blanket, with crumpled old cheesy brown boots protruding from under, a white National Cancer Society cap on his skull-shaped skull, a curved and immense and hopefully domesticated buzzard on one shoulder, plus besides all this a device for electronic talking he was trying to put to his throat in just the right spot for folks with throat dysfunctions. One of the civilians Glory Joy had prone to the floor swears later how he seen out-of-town dirt caked on the tattery soles of T-Rex's boots, seen a tiny inscripted, impending, glowing fire in T-Rex's one eye, a also tiny doom, cancer, burning cursive in the other, and this supine civilian was the first saw the rich orange of the jelly jars of illegal, unstable sweet potato whiskey that T-Rex commenced to pull out of a soft sheepskin satchel he had with him under that unwholesome blanket. Got the jars out and tossed them to the Ranger, who passed them around. We passed the jars around and unscrewed Minogue's bootleg lids. We was silent at our table, expected T-Rex dead, or at least twisted, traumatized, Nunn struck.
"Hi,"
he said. 8 was the malignant and malignified TRex Minogue. Told us in Simple Ranger how Chuck Nunn Jr. did flee to unknown and foreign locales, manipulated his wicked chariot plus disease-ridden self to where we all couldn't avoid but look right at him and his bird, held his little vibrator-esque talking tube to his gizzardly, liver-spotted to hell, throat, lifted a jar of potato whiskey to the dusty light, told us some facts on how C. Nunn Jr. pulled up to the lush and isolated Minogue homestead in his heavy cement mixer, freshly refit eyes, moral unconsciousness, and a fine fettle, not respective. How Nunn right off laid out the 2 geologic Enid ranch hands, who was on their way off the TRM spread to take their women skeet shooting. How Nunn laid them out, kicked them where they laid, and rogered their women. How subsequently, not very, Nunn manufactured a unarchitectural and spontaneous entryway in the bay window of the front of T-Rex's spread's big house, and then how Nunn, on the spot, performed for TRex Minogue in his wheelchair, in his front parlor, a uncontrolled and optically hazardous dance of blank white mindless rage that turned out to be one complex and complete charade, for some words bore semantic kin to wrath, damage, retaliation, so on. Now the buzzards outside the outside Minogue, Oklahoma bar was down, sitting row on straight and orderly row on the edge of Minogue land stretching off toward dirt. Appeared to us through the windows like fat bad clerics. Soft and plump, teetery, red-eyed, wrapped up tight in soft black coats of ecumenism and observation. Had orange beaks and claws. Was a good 1,000 orange beaks out there, double on the claws, lined up. TRex Minogue was asking us to drink to his death.
"To death, gents, ladies, civilians, ranger,"
he said in a rich electricity of mechanical voice box. He hefted a jar of yam liquor up, and Glory Joy grinned unpleasant and right off lifted hers up with an enthusiasm I got to call sardonic. Upright civilians commenced to lift too, and finally myself, and under the pyramid of bottles on our table there was a quiet community toast to the publicity and temporariness of TRex Minogue, who explained while he poured rounds, his impending doom ravaged face dry brown and wrinkled as a circus peanut, hair hanging out his cap thin and white as linen off the deeply unwell, explained that when Chuck Nunn Jr. come 3 days past to damage and maim T-Rex and VV, he got informed in the parlor by T-Rex that the benign and pliable VV had already previously ceased and succumbed, in an institutional caring facility in El Reno months back, to hostility of the liver and smoothness of the brain. That Nunn, in mid-rage charade, declined to show either sympathy for the late VV or any sort of compassion or Christianity to the soon-to-be late T-Rex, expressed instead, through interpretive amoral dance, his own personal attitude toward TRex Minogue, plus some strong personal desires that had to do with the nullifying cancellation of T-Rex's happiness, gender, life. Jelly jars or no, we was objectively and deeply unclear on how Chuck Jr. and T-Rex got spared iniquitous criminality and grievous harm, respective. And was me, asked TRex Minogue, who was attending a itch between his buzzard's wings with the corner of a tie clip, how and where Nunn had spared T-Rex and gone, plus whether the moral coma and I and T-Rex centered rage and vengeance lust still now had hold of the fleeing and missing Chuck Nunn Jr.
"A titanic plus miraculous scene to see,"
grated T-Rex's vibrator. He detailed the titanic plus miraculous struggle of minds and wills that proceeded to take place in Minogue's front parlor that vengeful dancing day. None cataloging such T-Rex offenses as jealousy, neighbor's wife coveting, avarice, manipulation, illegality, explosions of turf and lamb, loosenings of eyes and consciousness, desecurings of abilities to love and requite. T-Rex, in his wicker chair and blanket, countering with a list of Nunn's putative virtuous qualities, headlined by charity via might, main, altruism, Christian regard and duty, forgiveness, other cheek-turning, eudaimonia, solon, devoir, told how he, T-Rex, due for consumption by his own malignancy in just time anyhow, refused to yield up fear or resignation to Nunn's blood-eyed blankness. How T-Rex's ravageness, will, and wind-blown statuses saved his life from a thoroughly amoral and fatal-minded Nunn.
"To life,"
intoned the ranger, nose full of dust and buzzard, eyes to quartz glitter by vegetable hooch, face shining with an odd and ignorant presence. Voice was still different, smoother, young, also familiar. T-Rex Minogue and his personal fowl looked at Simple Ranger, asked him some soft and intimately acquainted questions about the various shapes of the dusted Big Dirt air patterns, asserted he could hear the special whistle of the Rangers aloft land in certain storms of darkness, gray. Ranger Dunn nodded. His face come and went.
But not a bad career, Ranger,
T-Rex continued, referring here to the governmental dust watcher job Simple Ranger had had for a solid 40. But except T-Rex said wasn't actually the Ranger who had got hisself the cushy WPA angle. Fellow with the real cushiony arrangement was a certain old and holdout government clerk in Washington, D.C., who'd got his antique job under the original F. Delano R. Clerk was the one had himself the cush. His entire and salaried career was just sending Simple Ranger, plus this certain blind octogenarial Japanese subcentry in Puget, Washington, their checks every month. Clerk lived in big city Washington and owned TV, T-Rex revelated. Simple Ranger commenced to feeling along his own jaw, thrown by new fits down into a jelly jar of introversion and temporary funk. And just internal theorizing on how T-Rex Minogue possessed these far-off historical facts sent some civilians into a state of shivering that had T-Rex's vulture agitated and hissing, plus opening and closing its clerical wings, thus hiding and revealing by turns the spectral and disquieting, calm though, face of T-Rex Minogue, making his impending eye show red fire. The rows of autobonial dirt scavengers was still outside, now a tinch closer to the bar windows, watching, lined up. Things was threatening to get surreal until Glory Joy Dubois rose up, tall and shaky, looking the worse for a mixture of Rollin' Rock and Yam whiskey, which your thinking person don't want to mix, and proclamated in a falsetto of disbelief and anger that, 1. She disbelieved T-Rex is sitting here, leguminous, cool, and unscathed, if her own Chuck Nunn was as desirous to scathe him right there in his parlor as T-Rex implied, and that, 2, she was angry as an animal, plus forlorn and subject to devastation following the loss of Chuck Nunn Jr. due to the hurtful precariousness of his post-accident temper, plus eyes, angry as an animal at the galaxy in general and T-Rex in especial for his causal part in the above precariousness, forlornness, and devastation, and that the malignant T-Rex Minogue just better come out clean about the whereabouts of Nunn if he didn't want his wrinkled and senescent butt to make the acquaintance of Glory Joy's high-heeled shoe, but good. And T-Rex, whose historical thirst for the self and corporeality of Glory Joy Dubois is the stuff of Minogue, Oklahoma myth, a whole nother story, I informed the funked and othered Ranger. T-Rex, whose passion for our town's lone arm wave at beauty is legend, glanced, gazed, and stared at Glory Joy, till we all of us got skittery. T-Rex and G-Joy faced each other across 10 feet of plywood room like fields of energy, all energetic with lust mixed up with regret on one hand, rage and repulsion mixed up with a dire need for knowledge of none on the other. Simple Ranger's face had checked entirely out. The old and historical and adental man was dreaming out through the window into the geometry of bird and soil that stretched to the sky's tight burlap seam.
I took the boy upstairs,
T-Rex croaked into his box.
Took him upstairs to my own boudoir and to the window, and I showed the boy what was outside, is how I come out of the titanic plus miraculous struggle.
Addressed himself to Glory Joy, plus to Simple Ranger, who besides looking checked out now was looking also strangely odd, bigger, eyes both here and not, his head's outline too focused, some deep wrinkles in his face, stained by dust for all time, like slashes of number 1 pencil. T-Rex touched his fowl's claw with speculation. Rue.
Took the boy to my own window and opened her up. It was morning, 3 months exact since we buried my brother, who got consumed by my liquor, by poetic burnings and yearnings, by grief and legalities on account of under-influence driving, and the eyes and mind of Chuck and Mona May Nunn's boy.
What I see, whispered the big, sharp, clear new Ranger in smooth, new, clear, young voice, his paper-skin hands steady around his jar of liquor. There was non-spectral colors in his eyes. Ranger? What was outside? Said Glory Joy.
Was and is,
vibrated T-Rex Minogue.
Showed the boy where it all blew to. Showed him what his seatbelt done left him to look at and be.
Looked around.
Made the sucker sniff and see.
Drank up. Made him smell death on your own wind? Death he'd missed by an impacted whisker, as if that was a prize? Made him read impending and doom, cancer? Introduced him to buzzards and such fowl? The birds was at the windows now, all over them. Ranks broke, bar all dark, each window covered and pocked with a mabusity of cold red observational buzzard eyes, dry rasp of orange claws going for purchase on the dusty frames and panes. We was on exhibit to animals.
Miss Glory Joy,
T-Rex said.
I knocked that boy upside the back. Out come the eyes hanging. The eyes doctors, me, and VV paid for, put back together after they was busted.
Made him think he owed you his eyes? I incredulized.
Ranger, tell John Billy here he's missing a point,
said T-Rex. Don't owe my eyes to naught but the clean high wind, whispered Simple Ranger. Glory Joy stared. Your eyes?
Knock that boy's eyes loose. Out they come, hanging,
recollected Minogue.
I lean his puppy ass out the window so he's dangling his eyes out over the land. Wind blows them eyes around. Sucker can see straight down into everything they is.
We was all looking at the new ranger, tall and straight and other, each window a smeared tray of cold red watching marbles. Glory Joy took back her seat, dizzy with mix. T-Rex Minogue lifted his jar of deep orange up to the fly-speckled overhead light, swirled it around. You brought Chuck Nunn Jr.'s eyes out his head and made him look at dirt and brush and soil and fowls, I said. I was pissed off. You show him the waist-deep shit we all grew up in, like it's a gift from you to him? Gray sights and grayish smells we can't get out our own heads, and for that he declines to scathe you?
Something like that.
Don't believe it for nothing, Glory Joy wailed. Woman could wail. T-Rex done something sinister to Chuck Jr. is what happened. I agreed loudly, plus 2 civilians as well, with the sinister part. The ceiling commenced to creak and precipitate dust on account of the immense and shifting clerical weight on top. We was in the belly of something black and orange and numerous. Now, where it all blew to, whispered the smooth, steely ranger. I remarked how his jelly jar's colors was overhung with lush and various floras. Was me asked Simple Ranger how floras got in his liquor.
Gents, lady,
smiled T-Rex.
I'm here today public to say that me and Chuck and Mona May's boys' struggle ended where all things titanic end. In metaphysics. We done some together that day. Some macrocosmic speculation.
This one previous civilian, cleft palate, red iron hair, up and levitates. We look up at his kids. He asks the air in front of him, where did Minogue, Oklahoma blow to? Commenced to just rain ceiling dust.
Boys, wrap yourselves around something affirmative,
said T-Rex, his domestic bird now holding his box to his throat with one savvy claw.
Remember what's next and what ain't. Minogue blew to Minogue, neighbors. See yourselves. You, me, the corporeally phenomenal Glory Joy, the Ranger especial. We've been swirling and blowing in and out of Minogue land since twinkles commenced in our daddy's eyes.
Minogue is you, Minogue? Slurred Glory Joy Dubois. I couldn't say skank. We was all sleepy with vegetable fuss.
Minogue blew to Minogue,
Minogue said.
Under dirt's curves she whirled and fertilized her own self into a priceless pour. Lush dead elsewhere.
So where is it at, Minogue? Asks the palatal man, aloft in a cumulus of webs and dust and creek. Where's the meat of the bones we crawl on, plus eke out of, plus die and sink back in without no sound? Ain't no difference, sighed the ranger. He'd growed himself half a beard in just time. He sniffed at his liquor.
Where you at there, Ranger?
Smiled a certain far-off T-Rex. At the window, whispered the ranger, at the window. He stared into a wormy and boiling black pepper with eyes, red. Me and Mr. Minogue is at the window looking down at what the life and death of every soul from Comanche to Nunn done gone to fertilize and plenish.
Show them what we own,
said T-Rex. He smelled at his old hands.
Show what we all done gave via the planetarial actions of movement, wind, topsoil artistics, to the landed spread my own personal daddy first plowed, that I first fertilized to human black with the juices of his arrowed punctured self and my grief-withered mama. Ain't no Chuck Nunn from Minogue, Oklahoma that ain't eternal in aloft, sighed the ranger at the window. The cleft rigger got levitationally joined by some more civilians. Things was dark and singular. Aloft, intoned the damaged man. My eyes are free of my head and flat gray temper,
and I am able to see directly below my dangling self the plumed and billowing clusters of the tops of trees of meat, dressed in heavy with the sweet white tissued blossoms indigenous to Minogue, fertilized by the wind-blown fruit of the toneless curve on which me, my woman, my people move. Indigenous, I slurred. That voice there, John Billy? That voice there is Chuck Jr.'s voice, said Glory Joy, flat, toneless, curved, clay and white. When the high winds blew off country, the ranger said, I was able to hear the infinitely many soft sounds of the millions of delicate petals striking and rubbing together. They joined and clove together in wind. My eyes was blowing everywhere, and the rush of perfume sent up to me by the agitation of the clouds of petals nearly blew me out that window, delighted, aloft, semi-moral, new. Glory Joy Dubois up and levitated, also myself. Soon we was all uncommitted except to air and vision. T-Rex stayed where he was at, under us, by our pyramid of bottles studded with jars.
Shit,
he said. Buzzards was gone, flown home with a violence that set the edge of Minogue's soil to lifting and tearing, twisted and gray, only to get beat down by a sudden plus unheard of rush of clean rain from an innocent and milk-white sky. It fell like linen ware, strings of technical light, other such things. Windows ran smeared, then clear, then the rain shut down as abruptly as it had, etc., etc. The land commenced to look wounded. Dimpled puddles stretched off into nothing outside, coins of water bright and clean and looking like open cankers in the red light of the low-hurt red sun.
Before I die,
whispered the malignified T-Rex,
I need to know where y'all think you live.
He looked up, around.
It's why I'm public today. Think what this is costing me. I need to know where y'all think you live at.
He wailed. Sucker could wail, too, gravelly vibrator or no. His fowl got ornery. Maybe we'll just have some fine new liquor first, whispers a aloft ranger beside me, old, unbearded, sky-eyed. I saw for the first time how cataracted he was. T-Rex commenced to hand up jars.
Tell me, Ranger,
he said. Lord, but don't it look clean, I was saying over and over. Show me the Chuck Nunn Jr. I love, plus need, Glory Joy petitioned to a T-Rex maneuvering into a position for looking up her dress. I grapple with some unsayably fearsome temptations to tell Chuck Nunn Jr.'s loyal and near lovely woman who in all this landed world I loved. What's all that again? Said the ranger in a flat gray gurgle.
Have some liquor. Tell me where y'all think you live at.
Should have seen me grapple. 9. My name is John Billy. Was me supposed to tell you how, on that one fine dark day of Pentecost throw from Ascension, we all of us got levitationally aloft, moving around the seated form of Minogue, Oklahoma's expired T-Rex Minogue. How we passed, hand over hand, jar after jar of his unstable sweet potato medicine, each jar deeper in color, duskier, till it got like the washed and bleeding land in the colored outside. How we all, even and especially Glory Joy, got glazed and apolitical, also torpid, docile, our minds in a deep, loose, neutral gear. How I started the story of how Chuck Nunn Jr. done wronged the man that wronged him all over again, and how at a point in time, which is where we lived at, if the sucker'd asked me, we all, me and civilians and woman, and old lone listening sky-eyed ranger, we all crossed the thin line and slept, aloft. How we dreamed a community dream of Chuck and Mona May Nunn's good luck boy Chuck Jr., riding his own mixer and might and absent purpose high, chasing a temper, a daddy, simple rangers DeSoto and farm, and everything of flora, sheep, soil, light, elements, through the windy fire of Oklahoma's roaring, watching stars. Now go on and ask me if we wasn't sorry we ever woke up. Go on.